The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, depending upon where you are. I'm Dave Rubenstein, Editor-in-Chief of SD Times. I want to welcome you to today's program on guided unit test creation for Java. Before we get started, I have a couple of brief housekeeping announcements. There will be a live Q&A following today's presentation, so to ask a question, simply navigate to the question panel in the control panel, type in your question, hit submit, and we'll get to as many as time allows. Secondly, this presentation today will be available on demand on sdtimes.com shortly afterward, probably within the next day or so. Okay, so as we've been writing in SD Times, an effective unit testing practice is critical to good software releases, but scaling it can be difficult, and that can leave gaps in code coverage and result in releasing code with more risk than you might want. There is, though, technology now that can guide you through the process. And here to talk about that are Mark Lambert. He's Vice President of Product at testing company Parasoft, and Kapil Bhandari, Product Manager at Parasoft, and he spent most of his professional career at IBM working on the cloud and smarter infrastructure initiatives. Now to get things rolling, here's Mark Lambert. Mark?
Great, thank you very much, David, and thanks everybody for joining today. As David said, really unit testing is a key component to ensuring you can deliver reliable, scalable, and secure software out to the industry. And we at Parasoft have been focused on delivering quality software for a little over 30 years now, and JTest has been in the industry for a little over 20. What we're talking about today, though, is some relatively new technology that we've introduced called the Unit Test Assistant, where we did a big launch on that last year at JavaOne, and we're about to do a second big launch June 19th, and we'll talk a little bit about that at the end of the session. But before we jump in, I'd like to get a little bit of engagement with the audience, and we'd like to run a couple of polls today. So the first poll that we're going to run is around how much time your teams are spending on unit tests. So I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll, and we'll talk through this. So in a typical 10-day sprint, how many days do you spend doing unit testing? Now, we see a big variety of changes. I think, Kapil, do you want to talk a little bit to what we typically see?
Yeah, with my conversations with customers and prospects, typically we're seeing around 30, 40% of their time being spent on unit testing. So that kind of equates to maybe 3 or 4 days out of the 10 days on unit testing.
Yeah, and I think that's a very typical range. Now, we do see people spending more and we do see people spending less, and it really depends upon where they are in their rollout and adoption of unit testing. It also affects how they're scaling it in the practices, and that's what we're going to dig into today. So kind of running this survey now actually gives us a little bit of visibility into the organizations that we have on today's call, and gives us some input that we can drive towards. So I think we're almost there. So again, if you're still remaining, don't overthink it. Just click the button, and we'll actually close the poll. All right, and we'll share the results. Now, this is actually a little bit more interesting. So this is actually not typical versus what we would see in the world. So what we're seeing here are actually about 44% of you responded 1 to 2 days. That's actually pretty low. We'll talk about a case study towards the end of today's session where they're spending about 25% of their time. So I guess that would kind of fall into the same bucket. The other interesting one is the 6 to 7 days. So that's actually a really interesting number to show. I'm hoping that when we talk about code coverage, that you guys who are in the 6 to 7 days are reporting a very high level of coverage. So let's talk about some of the challenges, and let's talk about some of the things that we can actually help you with. So Let's kind of start off with a very basic initial question. Why do unit testing in the first place? So you want to do unit testing because it provides a solid foundation, if you like, to your testing strategy. And many folks within the Agile world refer to the testing pyramid. Martin Fowler, Michael Cohen also referenced this and have wrote a couple of different blogs around it. In essence, focusing on a large foundation of unit tests with less and less number of tests as the higher you get up into the pyramid, with a smaller amount of manual testing at the top, typically focused around user experience and exploratory testing. So there are a number of advantages to doing this. For example, the unit tests mean that it's easier to identify the problems earlier in your development process. You're able to diagnose those, but also get visibility very quickly. Because the test environment in itself is simpler, it's by definition more isolated. That means it's easier to fully automate it as part of your CI/CD pipeline as well. So it's a very highly advantageous. And when we talk to analysts like Gartner and Forrester, and they're surveying Agile communities, we see that about 80% of organizations that are implementing Agile say that they're doing unit testing. Now we'll dig in more into that number a little bit later when we talk about coverage. But many organizations actually struggle with doing unit testing and will identify that they don't have an awful lot. They end up with what we call an ice cream cone rather than a pyramid, more manual testing and a much smaller amount of unit tests. Now, the typical cons and challenges that we see to scaling and adoption are that it does require a high level of development skill and knowledge of the underlying code base. It is by definition the highest cost of testing. It's the highest cost for two reasons. Firstly, because within your teams, your QA resources are typically lower cost because you maybe are outsourcing them or for other factors. But also the opportunity cost of using a developer to write a test versus a developer to write functionality is often a difficult trade-off that organizations face. It also doesn't test the end-to-end functionality. Now, that's not the purpose of unit tests. That's the purpose of the higher level tests. But nevertheless, that is one of the reasons that many people will use to say, well, I'm not going to focus on unit testing, because they don't test something real. They don't test the true end-to-end. And then the last one, and maybe the most obvious one to us as we talk to developers, actual people who need to do it, they don't like doing it. Developers typically, they want to develop code. That's certainly what I loved to do when I was a developer, was making something actually work. But I do want it to be of quality. I just don't want to spend a lot of time testing it. I want to spend more time developing, less time testing. I do want to test it. I do want to make sure it's high quality, but it's not what I'm focused on. But the bottom line is, without this solid unit testing practice, I can't deliver reliable and scalable software. So let's talk a little bit more about how developers really feel about unit testing, because at the end of the day, this is your biggest challenge when it comes to adoption and scale. The biggest challenge about adoption and scale is getting the organization to actually do the activity. Well, I don't know about you guys, maybe I'm an anomaly, but I'm not a big fan of gardening. The reason why I'm not a big fan about gardening is, first of all, there's a big amount of work that needs to be done up front. And you can take the same view for unit testing. If I'm going into something where the tests don't exist, I've got this, in essence, blank field that I've got to start cultivating before I can even kind of get going. Plus, I can't just do a little bit and say I'm done. I have to make sure I have a comprehensive coverage. I have to make sure that I'm covering all of the parts of the code to know that I'm actually getting benefit from the activity. And then lastly, I've got to maintain it. And to be honest, this is my biggest thing about the garden. I can handle the first two pieces perfectly fine. It's that ongoing mowing of the lawn and making sure that the brown spots don't come back, especially living in Southern California. So often, I'll actually, when I'm talking to practitioners at conferences like JavaOne, KubeCon, developer-centric conferences, I will hear the word hate. And that's usually because of these types of things. How I don't know where to start, I've got to keep doing it, I've got to maintaining it. And this is the reason we built the unit test assistant. And the unit test assistant is a component of Parasoft JTest, which, as I said before, has been in the industry a little over 20 years. The unit test assistant is designed to guide the developer through the process of creating their tests, but not just creating blind unit tests that don't do anything, freeing them up so that they can put intelligence into those tests, add their creativity into there that's going to make those tests meaningful and ultimately more maintainable. We do this with a number of intuitive workflows and recommendations that, excuse me, that apply to the tests that are created not only by the unit test assistant, but also any JUnit test cases that you create today. The goal here is to reduce the time, complexity, and maintenance effort associated with unit testing. Now, as I said, this is integrated into Parasoft JTest. Parasoft JTest is a tool for Java developers to ensure that they're delivering quality, and quality means both reliability, scalability, and security. Security comes into play with our static code analysis, where we've got deep analysis that goes beyond what you would get with open source or free technologies. Unit testing and coverage, which is part of what Unit Test Assistant provides, as well as advanced reporting, both out of JTest itself, as well as in our reporting and analytics dashboard, DTP. JTest plugs into your IDEs. It also plugs into your CI/CD pipeline from an execution perspective, and it's built on top of and supporting open source frameworks. So what we're going to show today is going to be within Eclipse, and we're going to be showing JUnit and Mockito technologies in play. So what are the challenges that we've focused on with Unit Test Assistant? What are we going to show you guys today? So the first three challenges, the three challenges that we're focused on are, firstly, creating meaningful unit tests, not just creating granular automated tests that don't validate functionality, but things that actually validate functionality. Helping the developer achieve the desired code coverage metrics. And when we get to that, I'll talk about how to use code coverage to manage the team, not just use it as the only metric. And then also maintaining those tests, keeping the garden clean. Ultimately, what we're focused on is reducing the challenges associated with effort and, in essence, confusion, right? So often it's overwhelming, especially for a new developer joining the team. A new developer joining the team doesn't necessarily know how all of your code base is interrelated, and you're going to see how we can address some of those things. The goal here is to reduce the overhead that's added to development. And as I said, what we often see, and a lot of the research out there kind of falls into this 40% number, where that 40% overhead on development. My goal is to make that time more effective. And you can do that through the techniques that we're going to show you today. So let's go into the first one of these, creating meaningful tests. And I'm going to hand over to Kapil. And Kapil, let's go ahead and show the folks how we can do that.
Perfect. Thanks, Mark. So I'll be showing you today how the JTest Unit Test Assistant can help you create your unit test more quickly, reducing that complexity associated with isolation, and to be able to handle assertions correctly via its recommendations and guided process. So I'll switch over to my IDE here. Again, I'll be using Eclipse here with my JTest plugin installed. There are different views I have set up here. I'll mostly be working towards the bottom half where my UTA views are. And you'll notice as my code changes where I'm clicking, the context of my views will also change dynamically. So for our first case we have is about creating unit tests. So I've just created a new feature for my banking application, and I need to create a unit test for it. So typically what happens is I have my method, I have to go create maybe a new class and then do some groundwork to get my test framework set up, and then finally get to my business logic. And again, that's going to take some effort and some time. With the unit test assistant, I'm able to do that more efficiently and quickly. To do this, I simply will have to just interact with the IDE here, the code. I select the method, and then in my UTA action, I click on the create action. And here, what you'll notice here is that UTA has created my test case for me. It's done that initial groundwork where it's declared the variables and objects for me already. So that initial groundwork is already done, leaving me to kind of focus now on that business logic portion. So with this, I'll go ahead and modify this test to be more valuable for me. And you'll notice that as I click here on the customer object, the actions change. So in this case, we can either instantiate this object for the customer or mock it. So I'll go ahead and instantiate this object. And as I go through here, you'll notice these comments on the right-hand side. And this is where UTA is helping me guide me through the process of this creation, telling me I should look at these values and change them to make them more meaningful. So we'll go ahead and change some of these values here to set up my test case. Now the other aspect was around isolation and mocking. So that test case, or that method I was creating a unit test for, has a interface object that it was passing in as a parameter into my method. Now, when it comes to mocking and isolation, I may not know how to correctly isolate or what mocking to use. In this case, UTA has actually went ahead and created a mock for me to mock out that transaction object. So it's doing this leveraging open source technology, Mockito and PowerMock. So I'm left with just filling in the business logic associated with this mocking. So we'll go ahead and turn on the transaction that I'm working with and charge a fee of $10. So now I have my test case complete. I'm going to go ahead and run this test. So as I run this test, again, these are normal JUnit test cases. You can create these tests and take them and put them into any other JUnit runner and they will execute. You can take them and put them into your CI process and they'll execute. They do not leverage any dependencies or have any dependencies on Parasoft libraries. So we'll see that this test runs, and I think it looks good, but I noticed that to be valuable, I need to have an assertion. And in the recommendations panel here, UTA has actually identified that I need some recommendations. And I can do this manually. And if I did it manually, I would say, okay, I'm working with balance, so maybe I'll assert on the balance object and maybe figure out what the value is for it. But I may not know all the values or objects I need to assert on. And UTA can help me here. Not only did it identify that I did not have any assertions, it can help me track my method so that it can suggest which assertions to use. So on the second run, now the recommendations have came back and I have several assertions that I can use. Balance is one of them, which I knew about, but there's others in here that I was not aware of. And it actually has the assertions plus the actual values I need to assert on. So I will agree with the assertions that have been recommended to me. I can apply these assertions via the action, and now my code is updated with some valid assertions, making my test more complete. And I can go ahead and rerun these tests. And there we go, a meaningful, valuable test that has the proper assertions.
Great. So, what Kapil showed us there very quickly were three things. The first was how we can create the test cases with, in essence, one click. Now, there is functionality within the IDE that can help the developer create the skeleton, but it doesn't do any of the declarations. It doesn't do any interrogation of the code base to understand how you need to instantiate objects to exercise that method. What UTA did there was cut all of that out, immediately creating a template that's meaningful to start with hooks that can guide me into focusing on the business logic. The second thing is isolation. Now, what we showed you there was, in essence, a fully automated mock. So that was created just by interrogating the code. As you may have noticed, it was an interface. Interfaces are typically a little challenging because you don't know what objects to instantiate, and a mock can really help you there. There's a lot more functionality around mocking and how we can guide you, but obviously we don't want to go into all of those granular details during a webinar like today. Then the third thing was around assertions. And as Kapil mentioned, when you're looking at code, you might say, okay, I understand what I need to assert, but you might miss something. Also, to figure out what values you should be asserting is going to require a lot of poking around inside of the code, copying, pasting values potentially from the debugger, and putting those into there. This is actually the first thing that we're going to show you around assertions today. We're going to show you something else at the end of the session when we talk about maintaining test cases. But both of these work together where you can actually make the whole process of putting assertions into the test a lot more powerful. So let's now do another quick poll. So we've created our tests. And we've done some work. You saw that we got some initial tests working. We actually had some coverage in there that we'll show you in a second. Let's ask the audience now and ask about how much code coverage you get from your unit tests. So let me go ahead and launch that poll. Okay, so go ahead and click the number. Now, again, this is another one like the first poll where we've asked this question of audiences before in the past. So, we typically see our ranges, spread around. But I mean, Kapil, what have you typically seen?
Yeah, based on my discussions with customers, again, typically depending on their complexity or their level of unit testing, we see around 20, 30, maybe even 40%.
Yeah. So we typically see most people falling into that below 40% number. Now we do see that number change depending on the audience that we're talking to. So many times when I'm talking to teams that are struggling with getting unit testing going, I find that unit testing coverage number is lower. When I'm talking to teams that have more investment into unit testing, so I know we had a number of people in the audience today which were on that higher percentage of time for unit testing. So I will say that our audience today seems a little more sophisticated than a traditional typical audience. Then I'll see that coverage number get higher. But what I will typically see is that there's a cost associated with that and the amount of time that it takes to get there. Okay, so let's go ahead and close the poll. And let's look at the results. That's really interesting. So this audience, actually, the majority of people in today's audience are actually above 50%. So I will say that this what we're beginning to see more and more here today is that the folks on this session are more sophisticated from the point of view of unit testing. So typically what you're looking at is you're probably looking at the challenges associated with the amount of time that it's taking to do the unit tests, and also the breadth of the resources that you're having to use to create the unit testing. But this is really good to see that indeed adoption of unit testing is growing more and more as we're talking with organizations. Anything you'd add to that, Phil?
Yeah, that's right. And I think as companies move into Agile, the unit testing is becoming more popular, and I think that's what's driving a lot of the coverage data.
Great. Okay, so let's go back to the slides. So let's focus and talk about achieving that coverage. So how can we help streamline the process of getting to those coverage numbers, Stefan?
Yeah, so in the second session here, I'll be talking about how JTest Unit Test Assistant can help you quickly uncover those areas of untested code. Then we'll look at how to cover all these use cases within your method or function, and then quickly create multiple unit tests for all your methods within a particular package or project. So switching back to my IDE here, we'll continue from where we left off here. So when talking about coverage, let's look at our coverage data from what we have currently. So if we look at our account class, we're at 58%, and at our package, we're about 37%. And so you'll notice on that last execution, there was a recommendation from UTA saying, I have some uncovered code. So let's go ahead and jump into that uncovered code. Here we go. We have a section of code that's uncovered, and I need to be able to cover it. So I need to have a test case that has a balance less than -500. Now, what I could do here is I manually can go create a new test, start with a blank slate, or maybe I have an existing test, but I have to go find it and then figure out what the test data is to change it. But with UTA, not only does it identify that I have uncovered code, but it actually will able to help me understand which existing test that I have that I can reuse to get me to cover this code. So what we're looking at here is that UTA has identified 2 existing test cases that I had and telling me there's one that it recommends that's going to get me closer to covering this untested area of code. So we'll go ahead and accept the recommendation here and clone this test. So there we go. The test is cloned. The initialization is already done. I have to concentrate on the exact value that I want to test on. So we'll go ahead and change this value. It was testing at -100, so we'll do -600 here. And we'll go ahead and re-execute this test. And as the test runs, the coverage data gets updated, and I can go back to my account class and notice that now I've plugged those holes in my coverage, right? So those spots that were missing now have been covered by my test execution here. And you'll see that my account class has now increasing its coverage, getting me closer and closer to that coverage number that I need. So let's get to our next scenario here. We have a set balance function here with 0 coverage. Now, this one's around use cases. We have 3 use cases here that we want to cover. I can cover these by creating 3 separate unit tests. Maybe I can use parameterized tests. But again, that's going to take some manual effort trying to create and set up and figuring out what that test data is. With UTA, again, leveraging the view and the actions, I'm able to quickly create a parameterized test. And doing so, I can actually generate either test data within the code or via a CSV file. Let's just go ahead and do code and click OK. Here, a parameterized test is created. And again, not starting off with a blank slate, I actually have everything I need initialized in here. If there's any mocking, that will also be completed for me. And you'll notice here, there are pre-configured test data for me for this test. So I'll go ahead and just complete this test and run it. As it runs, we'll go back again and notice that now I've gotten more coverage for this method. I'm up to 75%. 2 out of the 3 use cases have been met. There's 1 use case that's failing. This case is a little more complex, so I have to look at the business logic and adjust my values as necessary. So in this case, I need a balance that's above 5,000, but below 10,000. So I'll go into my test here and choose a value that will satisfy this test. I'll change my value, and again, rerun my test very quickly. I've been able to do a parameterized test here, and if I go back now, you'll notice that I've covered all 3 of my use cases, and I'm good to go here. So the last aspect of this achieving coverage is around creating a lot of unit tests. So if I've inherited, let's say, legacy code, and I want to create a baseline coverage for all my tests or for all my code, I'm going to need to create unit tests for all that code. And it's going to take a lot of time and effort. It could be a team effort thing. But with UTA, we're able to leverage a bulk creation. And with this, we can click on a package or project or multiple classes and execute the bulk creation function to easily create tests. So in this case, we'll go ahead and create tests for my banking application. And as the tests run, you'll notice here, I'm not sure if it goes pretty quickly, but these tests are actually generated by UTA. You'll notice 43 test cases were created with that click of a button, and 12 test classes were created. Now, I simply can click on the package, my tests, and execute those tests. And as the tests run, you'll notice the recommendations are being updated as well. So unit test is analyzing all the test execution here, and we're able to see now from our coverage that our package is actually now up to 67%. But we can actually go further and create more meaningful coverage by looking at the recommendations and updating the code so that we can get more meaningful tests.
Thanks, Kapil. So actually, let's talk about the things that we touched upon here. So the first was being able to easily identify tests that I can reuse to increase code coverage. So here's the thing with code coverage. If you're just looking at a macro number and you're just going, you're kind of looking down at the number of all your different classes, you don't know where to start. And sometimes you could end up focusing on the wrong thing, focusing on just simply creating tests for getters and setters, which will get you an increase in coverage, but really, in most cases, doesn't improve in an increase of the quality of your testing. What UTA has done here is it's identified blocks of code that you can focus on and get to driving coverage for those very quickly by reusing the test cases. And then we're going to identify the test case that gets you closest. The alternative here is digging around inside of the code base, trying to understand what test touches what file. JTest and UTA has done all of that for me. The second is to drive use case coverage and to cover not just branches, but also cover different data permutations. Now, in this section, we've been very focused on code coverage. That's typically because it is the number that everybody asks us about. However, you really have to think about code coverage carefully. We actually had a great article published on SD Times a couple of months ago, written by our evangelist, Arthur Hicken, that talks about the traps associated with using code coverage as a management tool. Code coverage is not an indication of quality of your code. It's an indication of test completeness, and it is not the number that you should be driving the organization to. It is a number that you should use to drive your organization to. So you're not just solely focused on code coverage. It is a good indication of what you've tested and what you've not tested, but being just a purely, hey, I'm only looking at code coverage in itself doesn't actually mean anything. But here, what we can do is we can help you to get to that first step so that you can then grow from there. And then the other part of addressing that first step is with bulk test creation. So trying to catch up with a legacy code base, or if I'm developing a number of classes in concert together, maybe maybe I've not been creating the tests as I've been going, but I want to kind of catch up and get going and get a jump start. And we can very quickly get you to a point where you'll have a set of tests that are achieving a higher level of coverage, and now you can focus on that business logic rather than focusing on how am I going to just drive to a metric within the organization. So around coverage, we've cut the time that it takes to get to those numbers so that you can free yourself up to focus on validating the business logic. But let's do our last poll for today, and let's talk about now as your unit testing suite grows. Now, before I trigger the poll, I want you to understand what I'm asking here. As your test suite grows, obviously the amount of time that it takes to execute that test suite is going to grow as well. What I'm talking about here is how long would it take you to execute your unit test suite if you were a developer and you were running it on your desktop? Obviously, we can reduce that time as part of my CI by doing parallel builds and server farms and what have you. But let's go ahead and run this poll, and then we'll talk a little bit more about typically what we see. So many times what you're going to be focused on is to say, okay, if I want to have a valid unit testing suite, it needs to run within less than 50 minutes. Actually, less than 10 minutes is often what I hear. The trouble is that unit testing suite is going to be very difficult for you to ensure that it's got complete test coverage. Now, we've not asked this question before, so it's going to be very interesting to see what we get from the point of view of the audience. But you know, Kapil, maybe we can talk a little bit about what we see when we talk to typical clients that have grown their test coverage.
Yeah, so this question can depend based on the size of your project and how big your suites are. So I'm seeing tests that can run between 1 hour, maybe up to 4 hours, but it just depends again on the project size.
Okay, yeah, and I think that's fair to note as well. I mean, even we at Parasoft have testing suites that vary significantly depending upon the maturity of the project, also depending upon the size of that code base too. One of the things that we do at Parasoft is we actually have a very good developer to line of code ratio. So because of the way that we organize our quality practices, not just with unit testing, but with code analysis and what have you, an individual developer is actually able to manage a significant large set of the code base. Okay, let's go ahead and close the poll. It's going to be interesting because we've not actually run this one before. So, okay, interesting. So a lot of you, less than 50 minutes. That's good. That means you've got a test suite that when you're plugging it into your CI infrastructure, it's very able to quickly validate the code. That also means that the developer can run it on their local machine, but it's still going to take them 15 minutes to run the entire suite. And then we seem to have a pretty even distribution up to about 4 hours. Now that's also interesting because actually several people that I've talked to, when they have a very comprehensive set of unit tests, when they can really trust their test automation infrastructure to validate the quality of their code, it typically runs well above 4 hours. So that's an interesting metric here. I think that's going to be one of our follow-up questions after the webinar when we do our offline polling as well. So thanks very much for that. That's actually very, very useful data for us. Now, as you're working on your test suite and as you're building more and more tests, it becomes a challenge, right? Because you have to maintain them, but you also want to make sure that you're leveraging them correctly as you go through your development process. Let's go ahead and look at some of those things that we can help with.
Yeah, so as you go through the maintenance of it, UTA can help find instabilities in your test suite. And then we can also look at how to address those unit test failures. And then UTA can also help identify and run and execute the correct test based on your code changes that you've made. So let's go back into the IDE and continue from where we left off here. So instabilities can occur in the test suite. For example, we have in the CI process, the test suite fails, but on my local run, my test execution passes. And then this is due to the interactions or the dependencies that are hidden between the test execution or the test cases. And this often happens because of the unit tests sharing global data, for example, maybe a system property. And to find these interactions between the tests that are causing this failure is a time-consuming process. You may have to segment your test suite into different sections to identify or at least narrow down which interactions are causing these instabilities. So with UTA, we're actually able to identify some of these instabilities at developer time. And if we look at our last run via the recommendations, we're able to see in our last run that we had some instabilities that were identified here. And we can quickly see through here all the instabilities that we have, and we can jump to one to understand what's actually what it is and how to maybe address it. So this is a quick way to identify the instability in your unit test suite from a developer side. Now, the next one is around failures that can occur during your unit test. So for this example, a failure that can occur is from a change in the business logic. So let's say my business logic changes and I need to change my code. This most likely will introduce failures into your unit test if you have not changed them. So I'll go ahead and re-execute my code here after I've made some changes. Now I know my unit test failed here, but what do I have to do now? I would have to figure out where the unit test failed, go into it, look at the data, maybe debug it, and identify if it's an assertion and update the assertion value correctly. With UTA, we've actually been able to identify that the unit test, the code change, and during the execution, we're able to see that the assertion is failing, which you'll see as a recommendation here, but not only is it telling me that the recommendation is failing here, it's actually given me a value to update my code with so I can maintain it. So in this situation, my status is no longer silver and it needs to be changed to gold. So with the actions, I can quickly update the assertion value and maintain now my test to be working better. So I can re-execute this test now. Now, let's look at it in another instance where I have another class here. I'm working with my shopping cart, and I'm just going to go make a code change here. So I will go ahead and execute this code change and save it. Now, as a good developer, I need to be able to execute all my tests or do some testing on it prior to checking in to make sure my code works. As the poll, as what the poll people have, as the data from the poll suggests, it could take maybe an hour to 4 hours for me to run my tests. So as a developer, I don't have the time to spend to execute all those tests on my environment before I check in the code. So as a bad developer, I'm just going to go ahead and check in my code and let the CI process run overnight. And we all know that's not a good thing. So what the unit test assistant is able to do is leverage the power of change-based testing. And what we can do here is identify how this code change is impacting test cases in my test suite. So what you're seeing here is I made this code change, and here are the tests that are now impacted and ones that I should run to ensure that my code is not going to fail these tests, or maybe I need to go update these tests. So I'll go ahead and select all these tests and execute them. And as they execute, I'm able to now not only identify the tests that I need to run, but do this locally and optimize this workflow of mine before I check in the code.
Yeah, so this is an interesting one to reference, especially given the data from the poll, right? So when you've got a growing set of tests, you want to be able to very quickly validate the changes that you've made into the code base. So actually what one of our teams once said, the change is the most dangerous thing you can do to any code base. So what we've actually shown you here are actually two things, right? Well, the first one is being able to not only quickly take you to where the assertions are, which you can do a lot of that in the IDE, but we'll also very quickly refactor those changes to reinforce or reset the regressions. What we've done here is we've actually dynamically created, in essence, a JUnit test suite that in this case is testing a Spring application. And we've built that by analyzing the hundreds of tests that are associated with this code base and picking out just the ones which are touched by, or just the ones that touch that class that I'm going ahead and making the change with. Therefore, being able to very quickly get feedback that I've not changed something that's damaging. Now, also at the same time, this is an interesting one to actually do from the point of view of testing the quality of your test case as well. So you may want to make changes, rerun the tests that are touching it and see if they identify regression. This is an interesting parallel thing, which is called mutation testing, which is potentially a use of this technology too. So we touched on three things during the session. The first is we talked about the unstable test environments, and as Kapil said, that's something that actually we've experienced ourselves at Parasoft, where you have a test that fails in your nightly automation, and then when you run it locally on the local machine, you don't know why that test is now passing on your machine, but it's constantly failing in the CI. And the reason there often is because of these inferred dependencies, or between test cases. Your tests are actually no longer true unit tests where they're isolated, so there's some hidden dependency that happened between those tests. And UTA helps you jump straight to identifying and finding that culprit. The second thing is around assertion updates, around how we can help address unit test failures. There's a whole number of tools within UTA around analyzing failing tests, looking at stack traces, and doing variable interrogation and things like that. But obviously, we don't want to jump into the details of everything that UTA can do within one webinar. But there's a lot that we can do there. And obviously, one of the things that we see as being a significant value, and certainly one of the things that our customers tell us that helps them reduce the amount of time, is these assertion updates. And then lastly, Kapil showed us the analytics of change-based testing, where based upon the changes that we've made in the code, we do an analysis of the tests that have been run within my baseline, and then identify which tests need to be re-executed to cover those changes. So we touched on the three key areas that I talked about at the beginning of today's session. Talked about how do I create the tests, how do I maximize my coverage and optimize my time with code coverage to achieve the code coverage, and then I talked about how we can maintain the tests. But what does this all mean for the organization? What's my return on investment for using UTA versus just doing it manually? So let's talk about a real world example. This is a case study of one of our clients in the insurance and financial services industry. And their specific problem that they were trying to address was they were migrating an existing application into a cloud platform. As part of that migration, they needed, well, it actually represented significant risks. So they needed to make sure that they had a solid set of tests that would validate the code as they were moving it and making the small changes that would have potentially hidden impact into the code. Problem was the existing unit tests wouldn't work in the new CI infrastructure, and they frankly didn't have the time to just rebuild them all. What they did was, to start with, they looked at, okay, what's out there today? What can we just use open source? And really what they identified was really the best approach was really manually creating those tests and using some of the IDE workflows that can do some basic assistance. The problem here was there was zero automation, and they needed to scale the team very quickly to achieve this migration strategy, so which meant they were bringing in junior developers as well as developers that were not used to the code base. So there was a steep learning curve, and that the practice of unit testing was going to have a lot of mentoring and monitoring. So what they did was they actually came to Parasoft, and with using JTest, they were able to focus the team on writing the code safely, making the changes that they were making to support the migration, and ensured consistency of testing practice, ultimately improving the productivity of the team and meeting the goals and objectives of the project. Now, what this particular organization was spending around about 25% of their time writing unit tests. Now, typically, as I said, we typically see that 30 to 40% in most cases. But even though they were only spending that amount of time, we were able to cut that time in half. In essence, freeing them up to either do more testing and go deeper with their coverage, or to focus on their functional behavior and streamlining the team as an organization. So how does UTA help you adopt and scale your practice? Really, we see it as three things. Firstly, we reduce the complexity associated with unit testing so that you can have the entire team contribute to your unit testing practice. Many times we see that organizations that trying to roll out unit testing will have a particular group which are very successful. It's usually one of the vanguard groups, the groups which are at the front of new technologies and practices. That's often where we see TDD start to appear as well. But then as they start to roll that out across the organization as a whole, they struggle to get universal adoption. And one of the first problems is the complexity. So here, this is what the first area where JTest UTA can help. The second is trying to ramp up and getting to that desired level of coverage. As I said before, coverage is a number, not the number, but it is the first number that typically you're looking at to ensure or get some visibility on your test completeness. If you have a low code coverage number, it means that it doesn't matter what the tests are doing, the reality is you're only touching a fraction of the code base. So the tooling that we showed you around how you can drive towards that gives you the ability to get your first tier of understanding of the quality of your test case and start practicing that or scaling the practice as a whole. And then lastly, it's really enabling you to optimize the time that you're spending when it comes to unit testing. It means that I can say, okay, I'm going to spend time building out the business logic, putting the inputs for the different business scenarios. I can spend my time focusing on that rather than doing the wiring piece. I can focus on the new development and the tests that are going to validate that. So if you really want to be a happy gardener, which probably reminds me I should probably buy something with an engine. I might actually then enjoy gardening. If you want to be a happy gardener, go ahead and check out JTest Unit Test Assistant. We will actually be doing a 7-day free trial that will be launching June 19th with the new release of JTest 10.4.0. If you'd be interested in signing up for that or having somebody within your team sign up for that, please see the URL here. You'll find a lot of information on that page. Actually, Phil, why don't we show that web page really quickly? So this will be the page you'll take yourself to, and as we scroll down through, you'll see there's a lot of information about JTest here, and all the way at the bottom of the page, there's a link that'll take you to the actual page or the kind of the JTest landing page on the Parasoft website, which is also where you'll find information about a whole variety of other products that we have available too. But we have 5 minutes left. I think, David, this is a perfect time to go to questions. And so over to you.
Okay, thanks. Great presentation. So the first question we have, curiously, how does JTest compare to JUnit?
Sure, and actually that is a kind of curious one. I think we probably tried to touch upon that several times, but this does come up, and actually JTest, JUnit, the two names kind of obviously are somewhat aligned. So in essence, as we said, these are just regular JUnits that we're creating. As Kapil mentioned, there's no vendor lock, so the unit tests that UTA create are actually regular JUnits that can be run outside of the Parasoft stack. They can be run inside of your standard CI/CD. They can send their data to whatever reporting dashboard you're using, Code Sonos Cube, for example, or Parasoft's reporting and analytics platform. We can send all of that data to whatever ecosystem you want there. Kapil, did you want to add anything to that, or?
I think you covered most of it. I think what we can do also is leverage existing JUnits as well. So even if you haven't created them with our tool, we're able to leverage that and even extend upon that.
That's a great point, actually. All of the recommendations that we talked about, especially the ones that come under that maintenance area around assertions, change-based testing, test instabilities, all of those can be just manually created unit tests, JUnits that you already have. So I hope that answered the question.
Yep, very good. So another question that we have, I guess, was asked while you were demoing and creating some tests, and someone noted that the tests that were created have the risk that they become change detector tests, capturing the behavior and implementation that the code has right now, not necessarily the business contract the API has to meet. And they wanted to know what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, that's a great question, actually, and very insightful. So the point of UTA is that it gives you guidance. The developer inputs the data for the business scenarios and the business logic. And the assertions are created to capture your expected output of that data. So it's not that you just blindly create the test and then you walk away. We're freeing you up so that you can focus on what the correct business logic is to cover your scenarios. The point of the assertions is to capture the behavior, though, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to build a test that'll provide me regressions to ensure that I'm uncovering the correct things. Now, we showed you the simple way of just clicking the button and having the assertions added in there. You can actually pick and choose which things you want to have assertions added. You can actually, there's another view within the product where I can look at the internal variables. And then obviously it's just JUnit code, or it's just Java code, so I could go in there and remove them if I wanted to. So Kapil, nothing to add to that?
I think you covered basics of it.
Okay, cool.
Okay, we're getting right up against time, so we're going to need some brief answers on the next couple of questions.
Got it.
One of them is, can you do automated UI and performance tests with these tools?
Sure. So actually, in the Parasoft solution, we have other products for UI and performance testing. Parasoft SOA test is the product you want to look at there. If you just go to parasoft.com, you'll see it. SOA test will do UI tests at the web layer. Its superpower, if you like, is testing the non-human interfaces, the APIs. There's some really neat technology there about how we can interrogate APIs from UI interactions and apply artificial intelligence to build scenarios at a more stable area. I'd advise you to check that out. We'll reach out to you after today's session as well to kind of follow up on how you can take those UI and API tests and run them under load.
Great. And we have way more questions than we're going to be able to answer. I'm going to assume that you guys will answer these offline after the session is over. But let me ask one more question before we have to wrap it up. Can this be used for test-driven development?
Yes. Now, TDD is interesting. We have this question a lot. We actually have a blog that's in progress right now. It'll probably drop sometime next month. So TDD, I see that as a spectrum. We have some organizations which are kind of purist, and they're writing the test before they write any code at all. and then other organizations which will be writing tests to really writing tests once the code exists in some form, a skeleton or some basic functionality, and then they're driving from there. So everything we covered when we talked about the third scenario, where we were talking about maintaining tests, assertions, instabilities, change-based testing, all of that applies for both of those scenarios. So my purist would already have the tests, I can run them and use all of those recommendations. When it comes to the folks that have some code existing, UTA can be used to help create tests that either reproduce an existing defect that I'm then going to want to fix, so basically create a failing test for the defect you want to fix, or as I'm expanding functionality, I can start using UTA to create tests for that expanded functionality. So TDD is a longer conversation. There's some other stuff that plays there as well, but I don't want to go too far because I realize we're a little over time.
Yes. All right. Well, listen, I want to thank Mark Lambert and Kapil Bhandari for a great presentation today. Hopefully it'll help some of you folks with your unit test creation. Certainly would like to thank Parasoft for sponsoring today's webinar. And I'd like to thank all of you for hanging in there for the hour, and hopefully you got some really good information out of that. So as I said, it'll be available on demand shortly, probably within the next 24 hours or so. And until next time, I'm Dave Rubenstein, Editor-in-Chief of SD Times. So long for now.